December 8, 1940, 10 Downing Street, London. Rain drummed against the windows as Winston Churchill sat at his desk, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Britain was standing alone against Nazi Germany. The Blitz was raining death on London every night, and Churchill was writing what may have been the most desperate letter ever penned by a British Prime Minister. He was writing to President Franklin Roosevelt, and the message was stark, almost humiliating for the leader of the world's greatest empire. Britain was going broke. The more rapid and abundant the flow of munitions and ships which you are able to send us, the sooner will our dollar credits be exhausted, Churchill wrote. The empire that ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface, that governed 450 million people, that had dominated global finance for over a century, couldn't pay its bills. Think about that for a moment. This was the British Empire, the empire on which the sun never set. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. British banks had financed railways across Argentina, mines in South Africa, factories throughout Europe. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London was the undisputed financial capital of the globe. And now, Britain was admitting it couldn't afford to defend itself. 5 years later, in September 1945, Britain would emerge victorious from the Second World War. Victorious, but ruined. Within 2 years, India, the crown jewel of empire, would be gone. Within 20 years, most of Africa would be independent. Within 50 years, Hong Kong would be handed back to China, and the mightiest empire in human history would be reduced to 14 tiny scattered territories. How did this happen? How did an empire that seemed eternal in 1900 vanish almost completely by the year 2000? The conventional answer goes something like this. Nationalist movements in the colonies fought heroically for freedom. Britain, exhausted by 2 world wars, couldn't hold on. Moral pressure mounted, and the empire gracefully decolonized, granting independence to peoples who deserved self-determination. It's a neat story. It makes everyone feel better, and it's mostly wrong. The real reason the British Empire fell wasn't military defeat. It wasn't colonial uprisings, though they mattered. It wasn't even moral awakening, though imperial crimes certainly deserved condemnation. The real reason was simpler, more brutal, and more fundamental than any of these. Britain went bankrupt, completely, utterly, catastrophically bankrupt. This is the story of how the world's greatest creditor became its greatest debtor, how the pound sterling was systematically destroyed, how American economic power silently replaced British imperial dominance, and how economic reality, cold, hard mathematics, forced Britain to abandon an empire it had spent 3 centuries building. Welcome to the real story of why the British Empire fell. The illusion of invincibility. In the summer of 1900, Britain appeared utterly invincible. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee 3 years earlier had celebrated the greatest empire the world had ever seen. From Canada to India, from Australia to Africa, nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface was painted red on the map. The Royal Navy was larger than the next 2 navies combined. British merchant ships carried half the world's seaborne trade. British banks financed development projects on every continent. British pounds were accepted everywhere, more trusted than gold itself. But if you looked beneath the surface, cracks were already appearing. Germany's steel production had overtaken Britain's in the 1890s. American factories were more efficient, using newer equipment and better techniques. British industry was living off Victorian-era investments, while competitors built modern plants with modern machinery. By 1939, the majority of Britain's economic activity was domestic or tied to international trade with Western Europe and the United States. The empire itself was becoming more burden than benefit.
colonial profits likely financed only a modest share of Britain's investment and capital formation, approximately 7 to 15%. Even more troubling, Britain had become overly reliant on its empire for food production. At the start of World War II in 1939, Britain was importing 20 million long tons of food per year, including about 70% of its cheese and sugar, nearly 80% of fruits, and about 70% of cereals and fats. The workshop of the world couldn't even feed itself.
The humiliating loan. In the autumn of 1945, a British delegation led by economist John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington. Their mission? Negotiate a loan to prevent Britain from literally running out of money. Keynes hoped for generous terms between allies who had just won a war together. Instead, he encountered hard-nosed American negotiators who understood Britain's desperation and exploited it ruthlessly. In December 1945, Britain signed the Anglo-American Financial Agreement. In 1946, Britain took a loan for $586 million, about £145 million at 1945 exchange rates, and in addition, a further $3.7 billion line of credit, about £930 million. Canada contributed another $1.19 billion, both at the rate of 2% annual interest. The terms seemed reasonable. 2% interest was generous by commercial standards, but the conditions attached to the loan were devastating. Britain had to agree to make the pound fully convertible to dollars within 1 year, open British markets to American goods, accept American leadership of the post-war economic order, abandon the system of imperial preference that had protected empire trade. The Anglo-American loan encouraged Great Britain to acquire more debts through economic subordination to multilateral trade and to revoke its title as the great world power. Britain was being forced to dismantle the economic structures that had sustained the empire for generations. The loan wasn't just about money, it was about power. American power replacing British power. The 1947 convertibility disaster. The most devastating condition was the requirement to make sterling convertible. For over a year, British officials dreaded this deadline, knowing catastrophe was likely. But they had no choice. It was a condition of the loan Britain desperately needed. On July 15, 1947, Britain removed exchange controls, allowing overseas holders of pounds to convert them to dollars. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Britain attempted to restore current account convertibility on the insistence of the United States, but the government abandoned the policy after a mere 37 days. 37 days, that's how long the pound lasted as a freely convertible currency. Within a month, the Bank of England had lost $1 billion. Holders of pounds throughout the world rushed to convert them to dollars. Britain's gold and dollar reserves drained away at an alarming rate, like water pouring from a broken dam. Countries that held sterling from wartime credits immediately tried to cash out. Speculators bet against the pound. Merchants refused to accept payment in sterling when they could demand dollars instead. On 19 August 1947, convertibility was suspended. After only 6 weeks, the UK reimposed exchange controls to protect what remained of its dollar and gold reserves. The exchange rate reverted to its pre-convertibility level. A devaluation was avoided only by the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Stafford Cripps, choking off consumption by increasing taxes in 1947. The British people, still enduring rationing and austerity 2 years after the war ended, faced even higher taxes and more restrictions to defend a currency that was clearly overvalued. Policymakers, markets, and the press drew 2 conclusions from this. First, sterling was no longer the preeminent currency it had been before the war.
Second, re-establishing an international monetary system with free capital flows would take longer than anticipated. The 1947 crisis proved definitively that sterling's days of global dominance were over. Britain could no longer maintain an international currency without American support, and America was no longer willing to provide that support unconditionally. The 1949 devaluation, the death of the pound. Britain limped through 1948, desperately trying to stabilize the pound, but by 1949 the pressure was unbearable. Exports couldn't keep pace with imports. The trade deficit widened month after month. Britain's gold and dollar reserves dwindled. Speculators circled like sharks, betting against the pound. On September 18, 1949, Chancellor Stafford Cripps made the announcement the government had desperately tried to avoid. The coup de grace came on September 19, 1949, when the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Stafford Cripps, was finally forced to devalue the once prestigious pound sterling from $4.03 to $2.80, an overnight 30% loss of purchasing power. Think about what this meant. If you were a British citizen who had saved £1,000, you woke up on September 19th with the equivalent of £700. 30% of the nation's wealth had been erased overnight. With this stunning act, the British pound definitively lost its global reserve currency status. The bankruptcy of the British Empire was complete. In 1949, sterling was devalued by 30.5% on the back of a large balance of payments deficit that Britain had accumulated with other European countries and an outstanding sterling debt of £3.7 billion, which had been amassed during the war with countries in the sterling area. The events of 1949 changed exchange rates across Europe. More than 19 countries followed sterling. Britain's devaluation forced its trading partners to devalue as well, creating currency chaos throughout Europe and the Commonwealth. The dollar, not the pound, was now unquestionably the world's reserve currency. The Bretton Woods system created in 1944 had formalized this reality. American economic power would shape the post-war order. British financial dominance was dead. And without financial dominance, Britain couldn't afford its empire. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The empire was about to unravel. India, economic necessity disguised as moral choice. The election of a Labour government at the end of World War II coincided with the rise of sectarian strife within India. The new administration determined with unduly urgent haste that Britain would have to leave India. Why the desperate rush? The conventional narrative emphasizes Gandhi's nonviolent resistance, the moral pressure for self-determination, the rise of Indian nationalism. These factors mattered, but they don't explain the frantic timeline. The real reason was economic. Britain, in effect, had no choice but to withdraw from colonial territories it could no longer control militarily and economically. Before the war, India had largely been left to pave its own way, with very few white Britons actually in India. All of this changed when war came. Where they had once been a substantial debtor to Britain, they were now a large creditor of the war treasury. Think about that transformation. For 2 centuries, Britain had extracted wealth from India. Now India held British debt. The power relationship had fundamentally inverted. India had financed Britain's war effort through forced contributions and unpaid credits. India was now Britain's creditor, not its cash cow. Maintaining British rule would require massive military forces to suppress growing unrest. Britain couldn't afford those forces. The treasury was empty. The British people, enduring continued rationing and austerity 2 years after the war ended, wouldn't support spending billions to hold distant colonies when they were struggling at home. On February 20, 1947, Prime Minister Clement
The humiliating loan.
In the autumn of 1945, a British delegation led by economist John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington. Their mission? Negotiate a loan to prevent Britain from literally running out of money. Keynes hoped for generous terms between allies who had just won a war together. Instead, he encountered hard-nosed American negotiators who understood Britain's desperation and exploited it ruthlessly. In December 1945, Britain signed the Anglo-American Financial Agreement. In 1946, Britain took a loan for $586 million, about £145 million at 1945 exchange rates, and in addition a further $3.7 billion line of credit, about £930 million. Canada contributed another $1.19 billion, both at the rate of 2% annual interest. The terms seemed reasonable. 2% interest was generous by commercial standards, but the conditions attached to the loan were devastating. Britain had to agree to make the pound fully convertible to dollars within 1 year, open British markets to American goods, accept American leadership of the post-war economic order, abandon the system of imperial preference that had protected empire trade. The Anglo-American loan encouraged Great Britain to acquire more debts through economic subordination to multilateral trade and to revoke its title as the great world power. Britain was being forced to dismantle the economic structures that had sustained the empire for generations. The loan wasn't just about money, it was about power. The real story. So what really caused the British Empire to collapse? Not nationalist movements, though they certainly played a role. Not military defeat, though battles were lost. Not moral awakening, though imperial crimes deserved condemnation and resistance. The British Empire collapsed because Britain went bankrupt. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The First World War transformed Britain from the world's largest creditor to its largest debtor. The Second World War increased that debt to over 250% of GDP, a burden Britain could never hope to repay. Sterling lost its position as the global reserve currency, replaced by the dollar. Britain could no longer afford the military forces needed to hold empire against growing resistance. American economic power systematically replaced British financial dominance. What later became known as decolonization was very often short-sighted, self-interested, and not infrequently bloody. Britain didn't gracefully grant independence out of enlightened principles. It abandoned territories it could no longer afford to control, fought desperate rearguard actions where economic interests remained strong, and dressed up economic necessity in the language of self-determination. The American century. The 20th century became the American century, not primarily because America won wars, but because America won economically. While Britain bankrupted itself fighting 2 world wars to preserve its position, America emerged as the world's creditor, manufacturer, and financial hegemon. The principles established during World War II became the foundation of the future United Nations Charter and were further refined at conferences between the United States and Britain, including Arcadia, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, which significantly reshaped post-war Europe and the world. These ideals also set the stage for the dismantling of the British Empire, although Churchill may not have realized it at the time. The special relationship between Britain and America was built on this economic reality: American power, British dependence. It remains so today. Lessons for the present. The collapse of the British Empire teaches uncomfortable but crucial lessons about the nature of power. First, empires are expensive. The cost of maintaining global dominance eventually exceeds the economic benefits, especially when facing peer competitors or major wars. Second, financial power underpins military power.
Once sterling lost its reserve currency status, Britain's ability to project power globally disappeared, regardless of how many ships the Royal Navy possessed. Third, wars accelerate imperial decline. The First World War damaged Britain's financial dominance. The Second World War destroyed it completely. Even victorious wars can bankrupt empires. Fourth, economic dependency destroys political sovereignty. Britain's reliance on American loans meant accepting American dominance of the post-war order. Economic dependency is political subordination. The legacy today. Britain today remains a significant economy, currently the sixth largest in the world. London is still a major financial center. English is the global language of business and diplomacy. Parliamentary democracy persists in dozens of former colonies. The Commonwealth continues as a voluntary association of nations. But Britain is no longer a great power in the traditional sense. Brexit debates revealed how much imperial nostalgia still shapes British politics, with references to global Britain and taking back control, echoes of an empire that exists only in memory and mythology. The pound that once dominated global finance is now a secondary currency, ranked behind the euro, dollar, and renminbi. Some economists predict it may eventually lose even this symbolic recognition. Final thoughts. The British Empire didn't fall because of idealism or military defeat or moral awakening. It fell because of economics. Britain spent itself into bankruptcy building the empire, defending it in two catastrophic world wars, and trying to maintain it in an age when the costs far exceeded any conceivable benefits. Understanding this isn't about assigning blame or celebrating decline. It's about understanding how power actually works in the modern world. Political and military control ultimately rest on economic foundations. When those foundations crumble, empires fall, no matter how mighty they once seemed, no matter how many territories they controlled, no matter how powerful their navies or how global their reach. The sun set on the British Empire not because of noble self-determination or successful liberation movements, though these played their parts. It set because Britain could no longer afford to keep the lights on. That's the real reason the British Empire collapsed, not the comfortable story we often tell ourselves about progress and freedom, but the brutal economic reality that empires, like all human endeavors, are ultimately subject to the laws of arithmetic. And in the end, arithmetic always wins.